Hello, welcome to Point to Point. I'm your host, Steve Carr, and today we're going to talk about tube substitutions. We have a lot of customers and people in general who ask, if I want to change the sound of the amp a little, or is there something I can do, or what do the different tubes do in my amp? So we'll describe some of that now, and this is going to be fairly general, so please understand that. I made a little chart here for the home audience, listing some of the common preamp tubes. And these are all interchangeable. In other words, the pinout's the same, the electrical connections are the same filament requirements. And here we go, our 12AX7 that we know, and there are many different 12AX7s, each of them different brands having their own flavors and subtle sounds, but on a gain scale of 100, that's a 100. Then you go down to a 12AY, which you saw in some of the Tweed amps. It's a lower gain, a little more hi-fi 12AX7. It's a little more than gain of 70, somewhere in there, 70 to 80. 12AT, see that a lot as a reverb drive tube, gain of 60. 12AU, some hi-fis, sometimes gain of 20. So let's say you had an amp that overdrived a bit too quickly. The very first preamp tube, 12AX7, you could substitute one of these lower types for a lower gain. That's not going to change, if your output section, your power tubes are overdriving. It's not going to change the overall power, but it may change how quickly the amp, the other parts, the other stages overdrive. And it might give the impression of a firmer sound. So that's certainly something worth trying. There's something else going on here in this list. As we go down in gain, we're actually going up in power handling, in current capacity. Well, what does that mean? A lot of times you'll see a 12AT7 as a reverb drive tube. And it's really like a little power amp used to drive the reverb tank. So this tube has a fair amount of current capacity that it can deliver. For a reverb drive tube, you really don't want to go up to these higher gain tubes because they just don't have the muscle. These have little less amplification, but more muscle as you go down. Now, let's say you had the reverb in your amp you thought was too powerful, too much splash in the tank. Great idea is to use a 12AU7 in the reverb driver, which is somehow, cameraman Mike found this amusing, and it is amusing, the 12AU7. We shouldn't pick on it. But you could use that one. Really kind of mutes the output of the reverb drive. Gives the reverb more of a kind of a pretty plate reverb sound. So this is actually something I recommend a lot for people who find the reverb a little too splashy or intense. I don't really find it that way, but some do. So you go to the 12AU, and it seems like a great fix. And again, people who want a little less gain or a little tighter sound, you would want to move in this direction. And let's look now, this will help, at a Rambler amp here, which is on the burn-in table. You can see a nice wave coming out of here. That's what we're hoping for, generally. But just to kind of come closer, maybe you can already see the preamp tubes in here. And this setup is going to be a typical setup for anything that comes from a Fender Heritage, or really even a lot of a Marshall, you name it. It's the shoulders of giants here, but usually close to the input, and this one is right below it, is your input tube. That's a 12AX7. That input tube, anything that happens here gets amplified many times through the amp. So this particular tube is going to be the one where if you change it, you're going to make the most difference, just because whatever difference there will get amplified. And this is a great one if you want to reduce gain again or get a tighter sound. You could go down this list. And again, I didn't really talk about brand-to-brand sounds. That's a whole different crazy topic. On our amps, typically the second tube is the 12AT reverb drive tube. Again, I already talked about that. You don't really want to go up because these don't have the muscle to drive the reverb tank, but a 12AU would, and it would be less gain if that's something you are looking for. The third tube, this is an example of choosing a type. Generally we use Electro Harmonix tubes. I really like the 12AX7 EH. Reminds me a lot of an RCA tube. this third position, which is the reverb return and the third gain stage of the Rambler. We use the same setup in the Viceroy and the Mercury, and to some degree the Slant 6. That's a Sovtek 12AX7 WA. We choose that one. It's a lower gain 12AX7 with a rounder, softer sound. It just really seems to sound pretty there. If you used Electro Harmonix or NOS 12AX7 there, the amp is a bit more aggressive. I just like the sound of that. Moving on, we've got the phase inverter and the tremolo. That's more of a worker tube. Changing that tube will have a subtle effect. You're going to have a more and more subtle effect as you go down. If you had an amp like the Slant 6 or like most black face Fenders or a Marshall, where the phase inverter is something called a long tail, it's a different type of circuit, changing that tube down this row will make a big difference, because that tube is what communicates with the power tube. So if you change this guy, you're going to change that interaction. So that'll hope I'm not going too fast. Alright, so we're doing pretty good here. Power tube substitutions, that's a little bit tougher. Sorry.